Have Patty Foley with us tonight, and she's going to be talking about Brehon Law, and I won't go beyond that because I know absolutely nothing about it. So, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming out on such a cold night. Brehon Law. Let me just, that better? Seems like a pretty dry subject. And how dry is it? I wanted to lead with a joke like priests do with their sermons. And I looked high and low on the internet and found no jokes about Brehon Law. Nothing even close. Nothing I could tweak to make it work. So I'm sorry for that. If you hear one, please let me know. I got as far as a Brehon walks into a bar and could not think of a punchline that went with that. In researching it, however, I found it to be not just interesting, but very, very impressive. And it makes me think about how different our lives might be if we were living under Brehon Law now. So Brehon Law is the ancient law of Ireland, the name derived from the Irish word for judge, brehon. Brehon Law was built up over time by circumstances and the acceptance of the people. The laws were simply the customs of the people put into spoken and then written laws by the Brehons, based on hundreds of years of development, practice, and social acceptance. Brehon Law is considered to have existed for 3,000 years, from the time of the late Bronze Age, between 2,000 and 1,000 years BC. To put this in context, 2000 BC was the approximate date of the death of Abraham, and 1000 BC was the time of King David. Brehon Law is the second oldest known legal system, second only to Sanskrit. So when the Magna Carta was signed by King John of England in 1215, the Irish had already been ruled by Brehon Law for more than 2,000 years. Wow. In the year 438 AD, a panel of 9 was convened by St. Patrick himself, made up of 3 Brehons, 3 kings, including the Ardrí or High King of Ireland, and 3 bishops, including St. Patrick. Its task was to examine the existing Brehon laws and eliminate any that were obsolete or pertained to pagan rites or were opposed to Christianity. These revisions were believed to have been written down, but the original manuscripts way lost. Copies of them, though, were made over the years, with commentaries and explanations added. So having been in existence for centuries and passed on by oral tradition, and amended under the auspices of St. Patrick, the texts of Brehon Law in existence today were written down in the 7th or 8th centuries, that is, between the years 6 and 800. For many years after the English invasions began, it was a crime to be in possession of a document written in Irish. Despite many attempts to save, hide, and preserve these manuscripts of Brehon Law, many were discovered and destroyed. Fortunately, in 1700, years and years later, a Welsh scholar toured Ireland and obtained 20 or 30 old parchment manuscripts, about 1,000 years old, which collection later came into the hands of a Scotsman named Sir John Sebright. In 1778, so 78 years later, a Colonel Valancy, who was an Englishman, was sent to supervise some government works in Cork. He had previously been stationed in India and was struck by the similarity of certain words in Irish and Hindustani. So he undertook to learn the Irish language and became fluent in it. He then sought permission from Sir John Sebright to inspect those old manuscripts of the Brehon Laws, and he wrote to Anglo-Irish Member of Parliament Edmund Burke about the importance of preserving them. Burke had them presented to the library at Trinity College, Dublin, where they remained in storage for another 70 years until a commission was appointed to translate them. We owe an enormous debt to historians and scholars Eugene O'Curry and John O'Donovan, who in 1852 undertook to translate the text of those first written Brehon Laws. They consisted of the original text in a large script with spaces in between, commentaries written in a smaller script in the spaces, and explanations of words or phrases squished into the margins. it would have been tough to even figure out where one line ended and the next one began with all the options. And if that weren't enough of a challenge, they were written in the oldest, at that time, the oldest known dialect of the Irish language, already 7 centuries obsolete. This was an amazing collaboration by the Irish, the English, a Scotsman, and a Welshman to save these manuscripts from being lost forever. And I can tell you from experience, we took a stab at some church records from really the 1800s that were recent, and between the fancy script, the faded ink, and that they were in Latin, it was impossible. So I can't imagine in a dialect that's several centuries obsolete what they went through. But the durability, though, of Brehon Law arose from a sense of honor held by the people who were governed by it. The laws expressed the moral power of the people and their great respect for justice and law. This respect was explained in an early Irish text, a triad, which states, "The 3 rocks to which lawful behavior is tied, monastery, lord, kin." The Brehon Law permeated society to such an extent that to disrespect and break a law was to disrespect your faith, your king, and your family, which was everything in that society. We would call it peer pressure today, but working in a good way. Societal circumstances were such that any normal person would just want to comply with the laws. Originally, each Gaelic kingdom, and there were between 100 and 150, appointed its own Brehon, its judge. There was no central government, only tribes and small kingdoms with very little travel between them except your immediate neighbors. The Brehon had a high position in society, and many of them came from specific Irish families. And those families provided generations of Brehons. The McAgans were Brehons of Connaught, Leinster, and Ormond. The O'Dorans were Brehons to the kings of Leinster. The McClancys of Clare were Brehons to the O'Briens, and the Fitzgeralds, Earls of Desmond, and other great families in Munster. The O'Hagans of Tyrone were Brehons to the O'Neills, princes of Tyrone, and the O'Breslins of Donegal to the O'Donnells and Maguires, lords of Fermanagh. In ancient times, the Brehon was a mysterious figure believed to be watched over by the gods. He wore a torque around his neck, kind of a solid metal necklace, as sort of a badge of office. It was said that if the Brehon failed in truth, the torque would tighten around his neck until the truth was told. The Brehon then advised the king on legal matters and decided disputes within the kingdom. His payment was usually a 1/12 of any award made, but he likewise paid a fine if he made a bad judgment. The Brehons were highly trained. The laws were passed down orally for thousands of years and had to be remembered correctly and exactly. And this was often done in the form of a very long poem. And that was all to become qualified as a candidate to become a Brehon. And there were, even way, way back then, several law schools in existence for training Brehons and lawyers. 2 concepts were central to Brehon law: family and currency for the payment of fines. A family was defined as consisting of 4 generations descended from a common great-grandfather. So just consider in your own family how wide that net might spread, from your great-grandfather to all of his children, to your grandfather and his siblings and all of their offspring, to your father and his siblings and offspring and yourself, and it included all of their spouses. My great-grandfather Ryan had 5 children, but only my grandfather married and had children himself. And he had 3 sons, and they had 2, 4, and 5 children. So the clan would be numbered 20 plus spouses, assuming they were all alive at the same time, which again, in the days of Brehons, between the high infant mortality and a relatively short lifespan, there might not have been that many living at the same time. But these family members, as defined, were responsible for any member of their family who got into trouble. They were expected to support one another and often had to collectively pay the fine or debt incurred by a family member. Again, peer pressure, but family peer pressure. As for currency, as we know it, in the days of the Brehon laws, there was none. There were no coins, only cows, which were used as a unit for trading and asserting social status, And the basic unit of this cow currency was one milk cow and her calf. Even land was measured according to the number of cows it could support. And when you think about that, it's a much more accurate measure than a flat price per acre, because it takes into account all the factors that would affect value, such as topography, soil quality, sources of water, defensibility. One of the Brehon laws states, for the best arable land, the price is 24 cows. The price for dry coarse land, 12 cows. A person's place in society at that time was based on their wealth and reputation, called their honor price. And this tracked their ranking on the social ladder, from kings to lords to professionals, to craftsmen and wealthy farmers, and then commoners. Your rank could go up and down during your lifetime, and more than once. One's honor price was every free man's most prized possession, and it was symbolically reflected by appropriate dress, equipment, manners, size of retinue, and reputation. The desire to maintain one's honor price was a strong incentive to obey the laws. A few ways to lose it, in whole or in part, are that a poet could lose half his honor price by overcharging. A lord could lose his honor price for refusing hospitality, or for eating food that he knew to be stolen. A king could lose his honor price by showing cowardice in battle. And some of the laws, one states, a creditor who holds your brooch, your necklet, or your earrings as a pledge against your loan for property must return them so you can wear them at the great assembly. Otherwise, he will be fined for your humiliation. And if a woman makes an assignation with a man to come to her in a bed or behind a bush, the man is not considered guilty even if she screams. If she has not agreed to the meeting, however, he's guilty as soon as she screams. So there is an ancient version of just say no. Neither the king nor the Brehon was responsible for punishing a wrongdoer, but it was left to the injured party to demand compensation. Then, if there was a dispute, it was referred to the Brehon to resolve and determine the fine. In the event of a crime, the laws did not address revenge, retaliation, or punishment, only full reparation to the victim or their family, a fine for the offense, and rehabilitation of the offender. This rehabilitation and absence of physical or punitive punishment was important because every person's labor was required for the survival and advancement of their clan. And in times of a feud, punishment was obviously discouraged because it would reduce the number of men that could fight. But some typical punishments, that is fines, from around 700 AD are for causing a bruise on someone else, 2 cows, and 1/7 of the victim's honor price. If blood was shed, the fine increased to 2.5 cows and 1/4 of the victim's honor price. For causing a death, the victim's kin could seek 21 cows and the victim's full honor price. In the event of a murder or serious injury, the offender could lose everything and be reduced to the lowest tier of society. This treatment of the offender differentiates Brehon law from almost every other society. We're only now beginning to see community service as more reasonable and productive than jail time. And the Brehon was only responsible for determining the fine, not collecting or enforcing it. If the offender was not willing or able to discharge his fine, it was the responsibility of his family. And they often met that responsibility by stealing his cattle. But society, although so far they've treated offenders pretty nicely, they were not going to be held at the mercy of a repeat offender or an unrepentant perp. In the absolute extreme, such an offender could be put into a boat without oars and towed out to what they described as beyond the 9th wave. That is, a point beyond which the tide would carry the boat out to sea instead of back to land. If the fellow, I presume it's a fellow, if he somehow managed to return to land, the community where he landed could either make him a slave or kill him, whichever they chose. The land laws under Brehon law stated that land was owned by the tribe or the clan, within which every free man had a right to a portion of land upon which to subsist. Another portion was set aside for the king, nobles, professional and literary classes for their maintenance and in recognition of their position in society. All of the remaining lands were held and used in common as arable and pasture land. Periodically, as older tribe members died and younger ones came of age, the plots of land were redistributed at random. Anyone who did not get to continue in his prior home was reimbursed for improvements he had made to it, but still he had to move on. There was no private property. The plots could not be rented or sold. There was no eviction. Arrears of payments due the king were addressed by the laws of distress. The tribes also set aside part of the land for support of the childless and indigent members of the tribe, and children were obligated to support their father on his lands, or the father could cast out the child and replace him at will. Lands owned by the king, and the king could own land privately, did not revert to the tribe upon his death. These were passed down to his successor by the laws of tanistry. And tanistry is the custom where the heir or successor of the chief or the king is appointed during his lifetime, not necessarily his oldest son, but generally the worthiest and wisest of his male relatives. Again, this seems to me a superior method than the English law of succession, which replaced it, where the eldest son automatically inherits goods and position, regardless of his aptitude. This treatment of land ownership under Brehon law in particular is considered to be one reason the English outlawed Brehon law and immediately killed the Brehon in every part of Ireland they conquered, because they couldn't tolerate the concept that the land was owned in common by the tribe or the clan. They wanted to conquer a king or a chief and own his kingdom, all of it. The laws of crime and wrongs are based primarily on the concept that an offense can be discharged by payment of a fine in cows. The Brehon lawyers outlined every variety of crime and tort and assigned a specific recompense for breaking that law, either to the wronged party or his survivors. The fines were comprised of two parts: the body price, which depended on the exact injury, and the honor price, which was based on the parties' respective social rankings. Fines were doubled for malice aforethought or premeditation. Clergy were fined more heavily than laymen, and a person of rank more than an ordinary man, obviously because they were expected to behave better because they had a higher rank. The opening words of the Laws of Contract section state, "The world would be evilly situated if express contracts were not binding." So contracts were either valid or invalid. And a valid contract was described as one in which each party receives equal value. In other words, it's fair. An invalid contract could be caused by fraud, incapacity, or lack of authority. The laws of husband and wife were very progressive in their treatment of women's rights, at a time when a woman was merely a chattel belonging to her father or husband everywhere else across Europe. In ancient Ireland, a woman could own separate property. In a marriage, the parties could be equals, or either party could be superior or subservient to the other. Their relative positions were determined by the amount of property each brought to the marriage. If the property was equal, the wife was known as a wife of equal dignity, where if the man had less property, or he lived off his wife's property, he was called a man of service. Generally, the wife could not enter into a contract without the consent of her husband, unless she had more property than he did and the contract was to her advantage. Otherwise, she would need his consent. If they were equals, the contract would require both of them to sign unless it benefited both, in which case one signature would suffice. If it only benefited one of them and was entered into without the other's consent, it was void. Specific provisions were made in the event of separation for an equitable division of property, taking into account the wife's role in advancing the husband's prosperity. No property of the household could be disposed of without the consent of both parties. The wife came to the marriage nonetheless as part of a basic purchase transaction. Her father was entitled to the whole of the first year's bride price, 2/3 of the second year, half of the third, and so on down to the 21st year, with the balance each year going to the bride. So every year the bride got a little more of the bride price on an annual basis, which allowed her to gradually accumulate some personal wealth and thereby independence. The husband was allowed to strike his wife to correct her, but if the blow left a mark, she would be entitled to a fine equal to her bride price as compensation. And she could, if she wished, divorce him then. Ireland is said to have produced the original copyright law in the 6th century Brehon Law case involving two monks. Excuse me. Finian versus St. Columcille. Finian had obtained a copy of the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. Columcille wanted to copy this manuscript, so he borrowed it from Finian without permission. And we know what borrowing something without permission means. Columcille made his copy, and Finian sought a legal remedy. The case was referred to Diarmid, the High King of Ireland, who ruled in favor of Finian, saying, "To every cow its calf, and to every book its copy," meaning that Finian, as owner of the original, had ownership rights to the copy, and Columcille was ordered to return to Finian both the original and the copy of the book. I presume Finian mended his ways, since he was ultimately made a saint. Oh, thanks. Under Brehon law, every accused had the right to submit to having the case heard before a judge. And if he did agree to have it heard, he could choose his own judge. The only way a victim or plaintiff could get justice was via the legal remedy of distress. It was utilized in cases of a crime, non-payment of a debt, breach of contract, or any other liability. And there were two types of distress: ordinary distress, which included immediate and distress with time, and distress by fasting. In ordinary immediate distress, the claimant immediately seized the defendant's property and moved it to an impound, since the property was cows, as incentive to compel the defendant to satisfy the claim or go before the judge and have it decided. Since the judge had no part in enforcing the decision he made, this preemptive seizure seems to be an excellent plan for the plaintiff to get paid. In distress with time, the claim would still be made, but the property could remain with the defendant for a period of time. And there were 8 successive steps in the process, which is ridiculously involved, including 3 delay steps that were fixed by law at 1, 3, 5, or 10 days. Distress with time was employed between parties of the same rank. Immediate distress was employed when a claim was made by a higher-ranking person against a lower one, on the premise that the lower-ranking person might abscond, and then his clan would be responsible for the debt. Distress with fasting was used when the defendant was of a higher rank than the plaintiff, and fasting was required after the demand for payment. The claimant would go to the debtor's home and sit outside his door without eating. The debtor was obliged to offer him food, to fast himself, and to promise to either pay the debt or submit to the judge and offer a pledge for surety. If the debtor refused, the amount was doubled, and the claimant could proceed to impound property as in immediate distress. But the social embarrassment of having a person starving on your doorstep, a person who was so outraged by the injustice you dealt him that he would rather die of starvation than live with that injustice, was pretty good incentive to make someone pay their debt. And should the fasting party die, the debtor would be legally responsible for his death and payment of a debt fine. Fasting as a legal strategy is also seen in Sanskrit, the ancient laws of India, and it was utilized to great effect in the early 20th century by Mahatma Gandhi. That tradition, as a tool to redress a wrong and effect social change, would be revisited by the women's suffrage movement in Ireland, England, and the US, by imprisoned rebels after the Easter Rising, and the hunger strikers in the H block of Longkesh prison in the 70s and early 80s. I would guess most of us can remember the news reports every successive day and the outrage as Bobby Sands' life faded away. So St. Patrick arrived in Ireland in 432, and the conversion to Christianity necessitated many changes to the Brehon laws. A panel convened by St. Patrick changed or deleted any law that was obsolete or pagan. Nonetheless, many aspects of those old laws, including laws laws regarding women's rights and marriage, didn't change as soon as St. Patrick changed them. In practice, they changed very gradually. Likewise, each English invader tried very hard to enforce English law and disregard Irish law. It was denounced by the 1367 Statute of Kilkenny as wicked and damnable, but continued to be the law of Ireland outside the English Pale until the days of Queen Elizabeth I. In 1541, Elizabeth's father, King Henry VIII, had proclaimed himself King of Ireland. The Irish language, customs, and legal system gradually began to be the English language, customs, and legal system began to be enforced in Ireland by the English. And over the next 2 centuries, every aspect of Irish society was destroyed by the combination of invasion and colonization. Irish leaders were exiled or fled or were required to submit to English rule. Finally, in 1800, the Act of Union formally integrated Ireland into the United Kingdom, making English law the official law of the land. The Brehon laws were ultimately replaced by what we know as English common law, which is the basis of our legal system here in the U.S., except the state of Louisiana. And that's Napoleonic law because Louisiana was a French territory originally. Certain aspects of Brehon law, however, have been suggested as improvements to our present penal system. In particular, the focus on restitution, on making the injured party whole, and by making some defined family unit responsible for the actions of its members, and a system of social status which would reflect one's upright behavior or lack of upright behavior. It certainly makes me consider what might have been if Brehon law had been allowed to continue, to be adjusted and refined as times changed over the years. It did lack any element of enforcement outside of peer pressure. The fact that people wanted to comply, to be held in good esteem by their neighbors, and to maintain their honor price. Consider today how many people routinely choose money over honor, fame over honor, what they want over honor, and no one seems surprised or disgusted. And wouldn't we be better off living in a society where honor came first? Thank you again for coming out tonight. I am so impressed by how ancient Brehon law is and really how long it existed before it was eradicated. But, and also, I'm impressed that this was the 58th lecture we've presented here since we opened our doors on all sorts of topics on Irish history and culture. So stay tuned for the next ones. They're all very, very good. We have a great lineup. There's a flyer if you want to take something home so you don't miss anything. And thanks again.